شروعات.
Hello and welcome, I'm Thomas Porteous and you're watching NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top stories this hour. China formally invites President Donald Trump to a Beijing summit with Xi Jinping, but trade disputes and fentanyl tensions leave Washington hesitant to confirm. Reports say the two leaders could instead meet on the sidelines of the APEC summit in South Korea this October. This comes as US and Chinese officials are meeting in Madrid to discuss trade irritants, the TikTok divestiture deadline, and Washington's push for G7 tariffs on China and India over Russian oil. Experts say the talks, the fourth in 4 months, are unlikely to deliver major breakthroughs. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio travels to Israel, stressing shared goals, including preventing Hamas rule in Gaza. His visit comes as Israel's strike on Hamas leaders in Doha derailed ceasefire talks, and as the UAE warns that settlement expansion could jeopardize the Abraham Accords. The Israeli military orders Palestinians to evacuate an area around a high-rise in Gaza City's Rimal neighborhood ahead of airstrikes. The IDF says Hamas infrastructure is inside or nearby and warns civilians to move south to what it calls a designated humanitarian zone. Tyler Robinson has now been jailed after the fatal shooting of conservative activist Charlie Kirk, as countless await formal charges to be pressed next week. Meanwhile, Utah Governor Spencer Cox informed that Robinson's family alerted authorities after he implicated himself, calling their tip crucial to justice. Venezuela says a US Navy destroyer illegally boards a tuna boat with 9 fishermen in its waters, holding them for 8 hours before escorting them out. Cacarus warns Washington is seeking provocations to justify a military escalation in the Caribbean as tensions rise after Trump's warship deployment. Ukrainian drones strike one of Russia's biggest oil refineries in Kirishi, sparking a fire after 3 drones are shot down. Moscow says the blaze is now contained, while Kiev claims a successful strike on Russia's energy infrastructure. Nepal's new Prime Minister says that she will only spend 6 months in office before holding elections. This comes after Nepal reels from 5 days of Gen Z protests, which led to the deaths of 72 people involved. Now we start in Europe, where US and Chinese officials meet in Madrid to discuss ongoing trade tensions, including a looming deadline for Chinese-owned TikTok to divest its US operations. This is the 4th round of talks in 4 months aimed at preventing further collapse in the strained US-China trade relationship under President Trump's tariffs. While no major breakthroughs are expected, an extension of the TikTok divestiture deadline is likely. Talks also cover Washington's push for G7 and European allies to impose tariffs on China to curb its purchases of Russian oil, part of efforts to cut funding to Moscow amid the war in Ukraine. Meanwhile, Spain hosts the talks as part of its efforts to position Madrid as a key venue for high-level diplomatic negotiations. Both sides aim to lay groundwork for potential future talks between President Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping, focusing on trade, national security and regional stability. Okay, we are now joined by Andrew Latham. He is a professor of international relations and he joins us live from Minnesota. Thank you very much, Andrew, for joining us. Pleasure to talk to you as always. Andrew, how significant are these Madrid talks in the grand scheme of things and in the broader trajectory of US-China relations under Trump's tariffs? Experts have warned that there might not be any significant outcome from these talks. However, a TikTok extension deadline is likely. What are your thoughts on these talks in the Spanish capital?
Well, I think in the short term, the impact is likely to be minimal. We'll see a few symbolic adjustments to tariffs, I think. We'll see an extension on the TikTok deadline. That's in President Trump's domestic political interests. And there might be a few other, at the margins, a few other largely symbolic moves. In the medium term, short to medium term, I think it's important in that it sets up future meetings of heads of state. So Presidents Trump and Xi Jinping will probably get together at the upcoming APEC summit. That's a hope anyway. And if not in that forum, then in some other forum. In the longer term, there's only one way to read this, which is not as an opportunity for massive breakthroughs, but as a modality for managing great power competition between China and the United States. There are frictions, and there are tensions that go beyond frictions between these two great powers, regionally and globally, trade and geopolitics. And they have to find ways of managing this. Otherwise, it threatens to spiral out of control with predictable and lamentable consequences. So I think if we see this as yet another instance of these two great powers coming together to mitigate and minimize these tensions, I think that's the best way to see it. The only other thing that might emerge out of this, and I doubt it very strongly, is some agreement on purchasing oil. This resonates in India as well, purchasing Russian oil. And again, I think the differences here are just too wide. I don't think China is going to accede to American demands/requests, but I think the United States will make those demands and requests. And it will make them in Madrid, and it will make them at the upcoming APEC summit as well, because that's in America's best interest. China's best interest is to resist American pressure on that particular issue. So no breakthroughs, but a good sign in terms of the big picture, managing great power competition.
Yes, Andrew, and how do trade, national security and regional stability intersect at this moment? And which of these is likely to dominate a possible Xi-Trump meet if it does indeed happen?
Well, I think if that does happen, the intersection of geoeconomics and geopolitics, if I can put it that way, certainly around the Russian oil issue. The Trump administration is keen now, at this moment anyway, on upping the pressure on President Putin and cutting off what they perceive to be one of the sources of its revenue to support this war. And China, of course, has very little interest in that it both wants inexpensive Russian oil, but also doesn't want the United States dictating these sorts of things. So that's one area. Another, which sometimes is below the radar, is IT, information technology issues, chip manufacturing, and things like that. China wants the U.S. to relax some of its restraints on American exports to China of cutting-edge technologies. And the United States, of course, doesn't want all of its supply chains to be relocated to a potentially hostile power. So there's some geoeconomics, geopolitics intersecting there as well. The TikTok thing gets a lot of airtime, and justifiably. I've got two kids who spend a lot of time on TikTok. The security concerns are valid and justified, I think. But the Trump administration has little interest, I think. First of all, it doesn't want to alienate a constituency, youth in this country, which it was at one point in the recent past, turning towards the Republican Party. But there are serious security concerns attached to TikTok. So that's, again, there's a domestic politics, there's a geopolitics, and there's a geoeconomics angle to this, because it's a big generator of revenue for everybody. So those are some of the big issue areas where those two fields intersect and overlap.
Yes, Andrew Latham, thank you very much for joining us on the programme. Always a pleasure to get your analysis on these matters. We now move on and over to the Indo-Pacific, where, according to reports, South Korea's Foreign Minister Cho Hyun will visit Beijing this week for talks with Chinese counterpart Wang Yi. The two are expected to discuss the potential attendance of Chinese President Xi Jinping at the upcoming Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit in South Korea. This marks Cho's first visit to China since taking office in June. US President Donald Trump will also attend the APEC summit in Jeonju, starting on October the 31st. Last month, South Korean President Lee Jae-myung invited Trump to consider a meeting with Kim during his Asia trip. Meanwhile, Chinese President Xi also recently met with Kim Jong-un for the first time in 6 years, signaling deepening ties between Beijing and with Pyongyang. South Korea is urging China to play a role in pushing North Korea towards dialogue on its nuclear program. Okay, we're now joined by Dr. Sanjay Kumar. He is a journalist for the Korea Herald, and he joins us live from Seoul in South Korea. Dr. Kumar, always a pleasure to speak to you. Could you, just for the start, go a little bit deeper into the relationship between Beijing and Seoul and what we might expect from these talks going forward?
Thomas, after forging the diplomatic relations in 1992, China and Korea has been cooperating well, but sometimes there has been some ups and downs when it comes to the security aspects in the Korean Peninsula. So a few years back, when there was an installation of THAAD, that time also the relationship was little rocky, but somehow Seoul and Beijing, they managed. So traditionally, South Korea and China, for South Korea, China has been very important in terms of economy, and US has been for security. And these days, from economic standpoint, also US is becoming more important. So this is the like conditions right now. But as you know, like recently, because of trilateral cooperation between Japan, Korea, and US, it was signaling a kind of unbalanced approach. And President Lee Jae-myung's balanced approach, kind of pragmatic diplomacy, has to be practiced. That has been the position. So that is why it is a diplomatic practice to not just engage China into the dialogue, I mean the positive dialogue, but also to extend an invitation to make sure that President Xi Jinping attends the APEC summit in next month, like 30th October and November 1st is the date. And at the same time, just recently after the victory parade, there was a bilateral summit between North Korea and China. So there is a North Korean aspect as well, because in that bilateral meeting, China did not denounce or not even mentioned this denuclearization aspect, which is very important from South Korea's diplomatic standpoint. So I hope that in this meeting with our Foreign Minister Cho Hyun, he is going to discuss on this too. So it has a different meaning and significance this time.
Yes, and Dr. Kumar, I was wondering if you could go a little bit further into this relationship that North Korea and China have. We all saw those images of those three leaders walking together, of Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and Kim Jong-un. Going forward, what do you think the relationship between and within the Korean Peninsula is going to be like moving forward, especially bringing Beijing into the picture?
Thomas, practically without engaging China, this Korean Peninsula cannot be very stable and peaceful. So it should be applauded that South Korea is understanding this peaceful coexistence kind of scenario in this East Asian region. And that is why South Korea do not want to miss any opportunity to engage China in a very friendly way. The trade relations are very strong, intact, and Cho Hyun's meeting is going to be the first one to China, although he visited India also recently. But after a long time, it is going to be a foreign minister's visit. And since he is going to meet Wang Yi, his counterpart, that is why it is more significant. Because if Xi Jinping decides to come to Korea, I think after 2011, he has not visited so far. Yeah, so it's long time President Xi has not visited. So once he visit here, there can be many diplomatic achievements, milestones, people-to-people contact. All things will be activated, and then that is why it is the objective of South Korea to bring President Xi into APEC. And there are possibility of
Yes.
you never know, like Trump Xi meeting as well here, which would send a diplomatic message and very strong cooperation signals throughout the world. So that is why we can see that next month South Korea is going to be on the geopolitical chessboard.
Yes, indeed. Dr. Sanjay Kumar, thank you very much for giving us your insight. Always a pleasure to get your analysis on these matters. We now move over to the African continent, where Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo are set to work with international partners, including the US, to overhaul their mineral supply chains. This comes after the two nations signed a peace deal in Washington in June, aiming to end years of conflict. The draft economic framework, seen by the Reuters news agency, focuses on attracting foreign investment to the region, rich in minerals like cobalt, gold and lithium. Key components of the framework include transparency mechanisms, third-party inspections at mine sites and cross-border economic zones. Both countries also pledged to de-risk the mineral sector and reduce illicit trade. But challenges remain. Rwanda has yet to pull its troops from eastern Congo, and the operations against armed groups like the FDLR are still pending. The timeline for full implementation of the agreement faces significant obstacles. The final framework is expected to be signed after a regional summit in October. Okay, we are covering some news from the DRC. An exclusive Reuters news agency report, which is telling us about this economic deal between a possible economic deal between the US and the Congo. We are hopefully going to get some guest insight into this. What's holding things back is the idea that Rwanda has yet to pull its troops from the east of the Congo, even after that Washington brokered peace deal just a couple of months ago. And so its implementation and in practice, this peace deal has not gone as smoothly as expected. The final framework is expected to be signed in October. However, things are not moving in the correct direction currently. Okay, we stay in the African continent next, where according to reports, multiple drones struck key army and civilian sites in Sudan's south on Sunday, a week after similar attacks hit the capital. The strikes targeted the headquarters of the Army's 18th Division, fuel depots, Karena Air Base and airport, and the Dakakir power station near Kosti in White Nile State. Additional attacks hit El Obeid in North Kordofan, where Army air defences intercepted drones with no reported casualties. The drone strikes come amid Sudan's ongoing war between the regular armed forces and the paramilitary rapid support forces, which has killed tens of thousands and displaced millions since April 2023. Efforts to broker a ceasefire between warring parties have so far failed. Okay, Sudan's ongoing war has been labelled the worst humanitarian crisis that we are seeing in current times by the likes of bodies like the United Nations, displacing millions and killing hundreds of thousands. Efforts to broker a ceasefire between the two warring parties have so yet fallen flat, with the fighting occurring between the paramilitary rapid support forces and Sudan's regular governmental forces. This is an ongoing war that has caused humanitarian catastrophe. We are covering the updates here on NewsX World in the ongoing Sudan conflict. Okay. Sudan, of course, has been going on for years, over a year now. This conflict, fighting between these two forces, both the governmental forces and the paramilitary forces. We're covering the attacks that have occurred today, where multiple drones have struck a key army and a civilian site in Sudan's south, a week after similar attacks hit the capital. The strikes targeted the headquarters of the Army's 18th Division, fuel depots, Kenaya Air Base and airport. And we're now joined by Andrew Latham, who is a Professor of International Relations at Minnesota. Andrew, thank you once again for joining us and giving your insight on this. Andrew, this conflict has raged on for over a year now. The United Nations calls it the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. What are your thoughts on how this conflict has developed in recent times, and of course the fact that peace deals have fallen flat since they have been started to negotiate?
Well, no, my first comment would be that this particular conflict, and indeed conflicts in Africa, tend to drop below the radar, as it were. People are focused on South China Sea, and they're focused on Ukraine, and they're focused on various other conflicts, and a lot of these go underreported, not by you guys, of course, but by global media more widely. And yet, you know, as the UN has reported out, the casualties are extraordinary. The word genocide, which is often bandied about and used in an ill-informed and incorrect manner, is certainly the case in this particular conflict. And so maybe it's finally breaking through. Maybe it's finally coming to the attention of the global population that there are, in fact, conflicts beyond simply those European conflicts and those ones that the United States is most interested in for geopolitical reasons. That, and this is a sad commentary on the human condition, but my judgment is that it is the human condition that the factory settings for us, in fact, are war, conflict, genocide, violence of all sorts, and we have sometimes developed the mechanisms, rules, norms, and institutions to limit those impulses, but those factory settings reassert themselves all too often in the course of human events. And we see wars like this, which are tragic, both in the conventional sense of that word, but also in the deep kind of classical Greek drama sense of that word. Conflicts like this, and this one in particular, are true tragedies.
Yes, of course, Andrew. And as you've said, they frequently go underreported by mainstream media outlets. However, there has been multiple efforts, international attempts to broker a ceasefire deal. Those, however, have failed. What role should regional and global powers, possibly the African Union, Gulf states, the United States, play now to contain escalation like this?
Well, in a humanitarian sense, it should be all hands on deck. I think there's no denying that both great powers who are involved in Africa, the Russians still, China newly, and the United States since the beginning of time, I suppose, or since the beginning of the American Republic anyway, have some responsibility, but so do other regional great powers. You mentioned some of the Gulf states, for example, and regional organizations too. The problem is this, that first of all, those organizations aren't as powerful as one might imagine or one might hope. And so their leverage here is somewhat limited. Secondly, the great powers don't always share an interest in containing this conflict. They'd like the conflict to end, but on their terms. and in ways that suit them. So sometimes they're pressing for peace, especially publicly and symbolically, other times not so much. But then the really frustrating, and I mean that in the sense of frustrating any kind of peace process, the frustrating element of all this is that this is an existential conflict for all the parties involved. On the one and there's the hand of history as well, the sense that on the part of one party, the sense that they are entitled to expand their sphere of influence, their cultural realm, their domain, their empire, if you like. And on the other hand, those, let's refer to them as indigenous peoples who are on the receiving end of this and who see that their right to exist trumps, if you'll pardon my use of the term, supersedes, I guess is a better word, all other considerations. And so there's little room for compromise there. There's little room for negotiated outcomes, which is why they're so difficult to agree.
Yes, indeed. Andrew, thank you very much for giving us your insight on that issue. We will, of course, continue to cover the Sudan crisis as it unfolds. We now move on and over to West Asia, where Israeli forces have stepped up their assault on Gaza City with heavy airstrikes, marking a sharp escalation from earlier operations. Although, unlike previous phases of the conflict, the current offensive relies heavily on aerial bombardments, reducing entire apartment blocks and large concrete structures to rubble. Earlier today, intensified shelling echoed across the Gaza Strip, forcing dozens of families to abandon makeshift shelters. Many on shore were where to seek safety next. Let's listen in to some Gazans fleeing the northern areas of the region.
الضرب اشتد في المكان واحنا من الصبح فاتين الخيام فوق ال 20,000 مش عارفين وين نروح. الضرب وين ما كان وصلنا الضرب هنا الشظايا والهذا. الصبح استشهد الشاب على الشارع. الشظيه كلمات على المطرح. واحنا مش عارفين وين نروح فكوا الخيمه ومش عارفين وين نروح والشحن.
اقسم بالله كل ما تنطلق طلق واحد بموت من الخوف. انا لي 4 اخوات استشهد في الحرب هذه ماليش حدا. بخاف يسيج دورنا. لي 8 شهور مرميه هنا. ما حدش بيقول لي وين انت؟ تعبت من كتر ما انا تعبت ما لقيتش كنت اروح ازوكيهم عشان اجيبك الاولاد. تعبت 5 مرات الله نجاني من الموت. هيني قاعدة مرمية مش قادرة. تعبت من وين اجيب مصاري النزوع.
Among the buildings targeted was also the residential Al-Kathar building, which was hit alongside other structures in the besieged city. Local health authorities reported that Israeli fire killed at least 16 people across the enclave, including 7 in Gaza City so far today. Meanwhile, the Israeli army said that it has begun expanding an area in southern Gaza called Crossing 147 to boost humanitarian aid for the population fleeing the northern sectors. According to the IDF, about 250,000 people have already moved south. A high-rise building, which the IDF claimed was used to carry out attacks on its troops, has also been destroyed. Well, that is all that we have time for, but we will continue to bring you more news updates from around the world.